evening from Frankfurt. This is actually very exciting. I'm sitting here at the Deutsche Architekturmuseum with a few of tonight's discussion participants, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our first evening in our discussion series, Kontext, Kontrast, Continuity, Heritage Conservation and Urban Development. And it is an event series which was invented because we couldn't meet in person. The first partnership event between Tel Aviv and Frankfurt, so hello to Tel Aviv from Frankfurt, from all of us, could not happen here in Frankfurt right now. So we decided to not wait until we can do that, but start instead the discussion, and hopefully next year, whenever it is possible, people from Tel Aviv can come to Frankfurt and see the projects we are discussing in the series, and even more then. My name is Andrea Jürges. I'm the Deputy Director of the Deutsche Architekturmuseum, and we are part of the organization who created this event. And tonight's discussion will focus on a built heritage in modern metropolises, urban development and cultural heritage under pressure. For this, we have tonight as speakers Mr. Heinz Vyansky, the former head of conservation of the state of Hesse and in charge of Frankfurt at the time. We have Jeremie Hoffmann, head of the conservation department, Tel Aviv Yafo municipality from Tel Aviv. And we have Katharina Böttger, freelance curator and urban researcher, who will also share some of her findings. Sharon Golan-Yaron from the Liebling House, she's the program director of the White City Center Tel Aviv, and myself, we give a short introduction on two aspects, and I will start with giving a very, very brief overview about what is the Neues Frankfurt. So, in 1920s, it was the time that Frankfurt, as today, needed a number of housing, and it was a growing metropolis. And somebody needs to turn this off. In the era of Lord Mayor Ludwig Landmann and head of the planning department Ernst May, the city of Frankfurt experienced a significant building boom, aiming to satisfy the increased demand, as just said. Over 10,000 over 10,000 new apartments were built in new housing estates around Frankfurt. What we see here is Niederrad, one of the excellent examples. And what was built then and what was significant was this idea of new housing, of new apartments, of a new form of living. And the Deutsche Architekturmuseum did actually a very, very good exhibition, Neue Mensch, Neue Wohnung, from which the pictures are taken, and to explore what was built then. So what the new apartments had was roof terraces, courtyards, electricity, sometimes with an own radio station, and the Frankfurter Küche, which is the invention and the mother of all the built-in kitchens we all know today, and invented by Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky to be efficient and not using a lot of space. In addition to the housing estates, a significant number of public buildings were built to provide the necessary infrastructure for growing metropolis. Here you see one of the public baths in Fechenheim. To explore, or to, let's say, as PR machine, Mr. Meyer was very inventive, and he invented the magazine Das Neue Frankfurt, which was read all over the world and which increased the knowledge and the, let's say, the recognition of the Neue Frankfurt all over the world. That's it from my side, and now over to you, Sharon, and to your little introduction of Tel Aviv.
Thank you, Andrea. I will also just give a brief introduction for the White City. 1 second, something is not working. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, they can
Okay.
see the screen. We can't not yet see the screen ourselves, but the audience can see the screen.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm so happy to have this bilateral dialogue also from the Israeli side. We're very excited here at the Liebling and of course the Tel Aviv municipality. Andrea, can you see my screen? I'm still not sure.
And I can see you. It's good to see you. Hello.
Hi, but you cannot see my screen yet.
I can see your screen, yes. I can see a woman sitting on a balcony.
Great. So this is Trudy, this woman we're speaking of, and I wanted to straight, zoom into this picture because it says in German, Trudy genießt ihren Nachmittagstee auf der schönen Terrasse in unserer Tel Aviver Wohnung. And for me, this picture really says it all because it shows this kind of mundaneness, this everydayness of this style in Tel Aviv, this international style we also call the Bauhaus style. It was brought to Tel Aviv in the 30s, mainly by immigrants fleeing actually from Germany in the 30s. So it was a fifth immigration wave of approximately 250,000 Jews coming to mandatory Palestine, most of them coming from German-speaking background. Sorry, I cannot. Okay, so this style was, although it's referred to Bauhaus style, it has a lot of influences. Some of it you can see here, like Le Corbusier with the strip windows that kind of had an local take with the climate conditions of Tel Aviv, but also influences of people like Erich Mendelsohn, the German architect, his dynamic functionalism, which he actually, when he saw these buildings standing in Tel Aviv, said, oh, it looks like Corbusier and I. So there's a very sort of vast building on site in Tel Aviv to give a roof over those immigrants who came to live here in Tel Aviv. And we see that the White City in the 30s really is a huge ensemble of buildings of the international style. What is also very interesting in Tel Aviv are not only the objects themselves, but rather also this historic urban landscape. So the setting we're talking about, which is actually a garden city plan by the Scottish anthropologist Sir Patrick Geddes. So there is a fusion of the buildings and the proportions of the street, and of course influences of the sea breeze that Geddes tried to take in, and a lot of lush gardens as well. You can see the proportions between the street and the buildings here. But of course, now Tel Aviv is facing a very big pressure. We are doing, on one hand, conservation, but on the other hand, we're already building up the city, and this goes hand in hand. Of course, Jeremy will tell you a lot more about this, but I think this picture really sort of describes the situation. This is an infinity pool on a historical listed building, which has just been refurbished as a boutique hotel, and you can see this sort of skyline in the background already, which sort of tells you where the city is headed. So this is it from my side. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Sharon. It was a great short introduction for our evening. And we will continue with 3 short presentations as mentioned before, and then we will open up the discussion. So please welcome Heinz Vyansky, and we have to go to the first slide and not to the last slide. There we are. Over to you.
So
thank you for coming.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to Andrea Jürgens and Philipp Sturm being invited. built heritage in modern metropolises, heritage under pressure. I want to give you some preservation kaleidoscope of Frankfurt, starting with urbanscape. There may be reasons like traffic, trade, banking, culture to call Frankfurt on mine a metropolis too. Right hand, and again on the right side there, we see newly erected the Riverside Financial District, including high-rise office buildings, a historic villa from early 19th century, backed by a new group of enlarged villas to live in. Left hand, to compare the state of 2011, showing the former headquarters of the chemistry enterprise Degussa, at this time already given up for new urban development instead. The project was accompanied by the town planning office of the city of Frankfurt. Comparing right and left, we realized that the new district appeals aesthetically international customers. In advance, the complete loss of traditional local architecture of the 1950s, time of the reconstruction after World War II. The buildings were not protected as historical monuments, but of course, they were a temporal embedment of monuments from that 1950 period. Urban contradictions. Reconstruction after World War II in Frankfurt didn't follow a master plan. The adoption of modernistic architectural and urban building was coexisting with continuous pattern of older times. One of two breakthroughs for motor cars after World War II passing the inner city of Frankfurt is Berliner Straße, to be seen here from east to west. The banking area as point de vue is spectacular, but the street lacks a unified spatial frame to guide pedestrian pathways. In the middle ground, not so good to see, I have to admit. In the middle ground on the right, 4-storied residential buildings by the Frankfurt architects Meid and Romeich from 1952 crosswise the street, lengthwise 2-storied shops together a well-known 1950s urban building motif. At least in the foreground left postmodern Museum of Modern Art opened in 1991. Meantime, the facade's plaster has returned its original light white painting. Administrative building around 1970. Up to now, most of the high-rise buildings in Frankfurt being historical monuments were built in the 1960s, or the design is going back to this decade like old Commerzbank building. Competition was held in 1968, carried out until 1973. In immediate neighborhood, we just saw the new Commerzbank Tower by Norman Foster, where too Commerzbank changed completely in 1976. Since 2016, the left behind building began to be modernized to stay a competitive participant of the building market. Therefore, the elegant curtain wall facade is going to be replaced. The steel panels were no longer tight, both air and water concerning, and lost the color of their anodized surface. The architects planned instead a ventilated double facade, the inner one to be a climate cover, the outer one to keep the significant plainness for the future of the now so-called global tower. Administrative buildings in the 1920s. The annual illustrated calendar edited by our conservation office referred in 2019, of course, to the centennial return of Bauhaus founding. Forerunner or pioneers, associates and responses later were included as long as the buildings were situated in the state of Hessen. Frankfurt buildings were chosen 3 times. First, Peter Behrens in an administrative building of Farbwerke Höchst, erected from 1920 up to 24. Recently, the expressive paintings of its famous central lobby needed to be consolidated and slightly replaced. The interior escape routes got improvement and glossed paintings as well as details like the tops of ventilation shafts, here to be seen in an upper lobby ambulatory, were replaced. The project Das Neue Frankfurt, as we heard, lasting from 1925 up to 30, featuring modern architecture as communal task and responsibility, didn't stand alone. Private and even ecclesiastical clients followed the same line and ensured, together with the town authorities, an own architectural identity of the 1920s. Housing estates. Second Frankfurt contribution to the 2019 calendar was the housing estate Am Lindenbaum, which is not a satellite town like Römerstadt, but rounded off the small locality of Eschersheim. It became protected historical monument after residents, fearing the housing estate was going to be stocked up, attracted the attention of the communal and state conservation offices. Anyway, it is not sure the status historical monument is sufficient to avoid stocking up. The urban layout of the housing estate done by Walter Gropius in 1929 is very systematical, nevertheless effects a vivid appearance similar to Gropius' housing estates Dammerstock in Karlsruhe and Siemensstadt in Berlin. Ernst May invited Gropius to Frankfurt and Gropius followed, just before he had quitted the Bauhaus Directory in 1928 and then was running his private office in Berlin. Public building. Last Frankfurt calendar 2019 contribution is City and University Library of Frankfurt, realized between 1959 and 1964. Architect Ferdinand Kramer was member of Ernst May's The New Frankfurt planning team in the 1920s. May left Frankfurt in 1930. Farther on, he tried to realize his ideas of mass housing estates in the Soviet Union. Many of the Frankfurt collaborators joined him. Ferdinand Kramer stayed in Frankfurt and worked as private architect. Together with his wife, coming from a Jewish family, he emigrated into the USA. 1952, he was called Director of Construction for Frankfurt University. He retired in 1964. Kramer's some kind of Miesian architecture is a cultural bridge from the 1920s to post-war Frankfurt. Today, the library building is, together with a student residence and the meantime converted Philosophicum, a most important element within the transformation of the former Bockenheim University campus, as seen right hand on the screen, into the new so-called Kulturcampus. Restoring Römerstadt. The restoration of in Burgfeld 136, now known as Ernst May House, done in the decade following 2000, was a turning point concerning to deal with the built heritage of the May era. For all of those who appreciate the new Frankfurt as a vivid cultural heritage, in Burgfeld 136 became a common focus. Some outstanding conditions were fundamental for the successful restoration. The owner of the housing estate Römerstadt, the communal housing company ABG, left the role of client to the tenant Ernst May Association. Architect Stefan Kummer coordinated preliminary examinations and carry out. It was teamwork of like-minded people committed to the original state of the building without modernization. Former conservationist Christoph Mohr suggested such historical model houses for all residential types in my housing estates already in 1986, suspecting they cannot realized in general. Renewing Römerstadt. The new Frankfurt housing estates are now recognized as National Monument of Urban Building. A condition preservation work can take advantage of financial support by German government. One of the now supported housing estates is Römerstadt, of course. Berlin office Winter Fuchs was engaged to research original housing estate and later alterations, supposed to be basis of a future design plan which guarantee an appearance close to the original state. First realizations can be seen, for example, in Im Heidenfeld, seen here. Considering the housing company standards, a new curtain wall facade arose, including outside thermal insulation, double glazing of the windows, new sole benches and sheet metal storage and repair of concrete surfaces carried out according to contemporary standards. A planning architect was not involved. It's difficult now to identify the renewed building as a historic object. Repairing modern architecture. A counterpose to Im Heidenfeld could be the repair of clinker facades, Granisteiner Straße in district Sachsenhausen, a small ensemble of 3 communal residential houses designed by private architect Ernst Balser in 1936. Need for repair were open masonry joints and cracks in masonry frames made in artificial stone. The evaluation of damage absorption led to the maxim to minimize repair, just doing what is necessary, of course combined with renewals as paintings. The repairs were easy to carry out, but the coordination of craftsmen takes time. Again, like Ernst Marhaus, it was teamwork. This team involved, in this case, construction department of communal housing company, again, architect Stefan Kummer, restorer, and conservation offices of City of Frankfurt and State Hessen. Building site will be finished in spring next year. Later, plastic windows will be replaced into wooden windows step by step when tenants are going to change. A work in progress which leaves history transparent as part of a general continuity. So far, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vyansky. We will now switch to Tel Aviv, to Jeremie Hoffmann, who's hopefully there, and will start with his presentation.
Yeah, good evening, Andrea.
Hi, good to see you.
Can you hear me?
It's really kind of exciting to wait until the picture shows up, to be honest.
Good evening, Frankfurt. Good evening, Tel Aviv. Hi to everyone. So I'm Jeremie, and first of all, thank you for this really interesting presentation. And I will take 10 minutes to elaborate maybe one point regarding the need of the city to adapt to the changes. And Sharon really well started this presentation. I will go to my computer, if I may. Screen. Can you see it? Can you see my screen?
We can see Frankfurt, Tel Aviv on a white sheet.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and now we see buildings. It works.
Okay, so when we talk about conservation, these are the classical image we love to see. Pure, elegant forms. In this case, it's Tel Aviv. It's a nice Bauhaus, classical. This Engelhaus that Sharon showed during 1934. This is the new stage. All images in this presentation were photographed 3 days ago. So when we talk about conservation, we like to see this perfect image, but what we don't take in consideration is the need of adaptation and changes. Because we start with buildings. The buildings have new needs. They have regulations of fire, of safety, of parkings. They need financial resources, etc. They need to be adapted to the needs. So in these images, you can't really see the effort that was done through the process of conservation. But a city cannot be conserved as... Could you mute, please? Someone is, yeah, thank you. So what I will try to show is the element of change. So looking at the right side, the building, the one with the long balconies, you can see the same building on the right side in this image. So you have the original Bauhaus building and then the extension, because the change is not only about the use of the building, it's about the surface and the form. So the modern city, or the contemporary modern city, is about new uses for these buildings. So an extension can be behind the building, like on the right side. It could be above the building, because one of the pressures of the city is the need to have more areas and housing solutions. So these extensions of the houses raises questions about the authenticity of the buildings. Whether what is authentic? The authenticity is about the building itself, the form, the original house, the architect, the year, or the authenticity, which is the new form of understanding the evolution of a city, is the authenticity of the process, of the society in which the building exists, and the new adaptation of the city to the needs of society. So this is the main conflict that architecture and urban planner is confronting today. Just a recent example of a meeting we had like 3 days ago, a Zoom meeting. Of course, we all work from home. So what you can see here is an image on the right side. It's an original Arab Palestinian well house in Jaffa, and it was declared for conservation, and it's a part of a plot who is owned by a private promoter. So in order to enable conserving this legacy, this architecture, this history, the promoter is asking to have financial resources and the ability to sell apartments, etc. So we have this, we can feel here the contradictions. So from the one hand, we're really happy about having the ability to conserve this unique forms of different layers of history of the city. But on the other hand, you can see this contradiction of architecture, these strange solutions that we are confronting in day-to-day work. Another example is the different uses of the city. For example, ports, which do not serve today as they used to serve at the beginning of 20th century. This is the port of Jaffa, a fisherman port. So these are the original warehouses that are transformed today to a center, which is a public community center, but also commercial center, because the port is empty today. People almost don't come to the port, and the city has the will to bring people to take part of this structure, to take part of the beauty of the port, let's call it like that. But still, it raises the question, are the new solutions we are bringing, are they part of the authenticity of the place? How they make the change of the adaptation of the city to a new era. Another example of this contradiction, again, is a photo taken 3 days ago, is the first neighborhood of Tel Aviv. It's called Ahuzat Bait, 1909, the early beginning of the city. So this is a conservation project of 5 original buildings, the last original buildings of this neighborhood. So you can see and feel the effort of technology and price that is done in order to conserve them. So what is the result? The result of what we're doing here? I suppose we'll do a good job, but the question that I raise when I go and see these construction sites, whether this huge effort, what is the result for the people? I mean, this is not the deepest point of the project. It will go down another 10 meters, of course, for parking lots and for a new high-rise building in the center, a new hotel, etc. But I still raise the question, does it worth the effort, and what is the result of what we're doing? What is the meaning of what our children will receive after these efforts? Again, in the heart of the center of a city. So the question of changes of the city, the adaptation of the city to these changes, just a small example of how fast these changes go. So this element you can see here in front of you. So I was walking with my daughter and I tried to explain what is this strange element. And I told her that, like 25 years ago, when I was in the army, in the base of my army camp, I used to go out at night and look for this strange machine to call my girlfriend or my parents, and how technology is changing so fast. This is not a very old telephone, but it's a part of a city, and I always raise the question: should we preserve them? Is it part of the city legacy, or is it just a normal change which we have to accept and take everyone? This is one of the last one of them in Tel Aviv. So should we take them out and just embrace the change, as we said? So the conclusion of the work we are doing, or a proposed solution, was written in a document which is called the Tel Aviv Document, was made by a reunion of modern cities that were in a conference in Tel Aviv in 2018. And the idea of this document is how it's proposing a mechanism how to manage changes in the city. So the main ideas of this mechanism is, the first is to raise knowledge, to expand the knowledge about all the different layers of the city, not only historical layers, but about quantities, about data, about managing data as the first tool to manage the city center. The second is regulatory systems, to have better regulations for how to promote these changes. The third point is civic engagement, working with different communities, because we tend to have more and more types of communities, and trying to work together with communities. One of the results of this decision is like the White City Center, a center which is working with communities, engaging to the idea of conservation and urban development. And the last one is create financial tools, new mechanisms for conservation of the city center, and working together with the questions of AGUL, the new tool for management of change in the city center, adopted by UNESCO in 2011, and implementing the new SDGs, like 18 SDGs of UN Habitat, and the new urban agendas, new international agendas about how to manage the future of the city in 2030. So this is the last slide. So the purpose of the document is to outline a set of useful guidelines and tools for the implementation of the recommendation on the historical urban landscape with the new urban agenda towards achievement, the Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is about culture, targets for cities that have or are about to be declared as UNESCO World Heritage Site, for example, based on physical and cultural attributes associated with 20th century modernism. So last but not least, I would raise the question, the latest international event was the election of the new president in the States. So I wrote an article about the question, is it the end of the capitalist era? So what I'm trying to show here is that history is something that not only happened in the past, but is happening every day, and we have to adapt our way of thinking to these changes. So that's it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy, very much for this excellent presentation. I'm sure we have plenty of points to discuss together after the next presentation, which is done by Katharina Böttger. She's a freelance curator and urban researcher, and she worked together with the inhabitants of some of the estates of the Neues Frankfurt, and she will tell us more now. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction, and hello to everyone here else in the Museum of Architecture and on the stream. First, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak today and share my thoughts with all of you about living in yesterday's utopia. What should be protected? I am an urban researcher and curator in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. Last year, I was working on an exhibition trying to answer the question, how do people live in the Ernst May housing estates, also known as New Frankfurt? We tried to discuss and illustrate how people live today in those settlements. This exhibition was part of 100 Years Bauhaus. It was designed to be curated in a participatory process, meaning that about 80 people, most of them residents of New Frankfurt, worked with me on this exhibition. At the Historical Museum in Frankfurt, we call this process City Lab, in which we try to constitute the city's diversity by inviting everyone to be an expert. During the research phase and the workshops, we learned a lot about the residents' most prominent challenge: living in houses or settlements which are as a whole or partly protected, whereas others are not. Looking back in history, between 1925 and 1930, 24 housing estates were built. You can see them in red on the map. They were built at a time of acute housing shortage, brought about by factors related to industrialization and World War I. New affordable living space had to be created within as short a time as possible. Housing policies were based on the principle of the common public interest. Housing associations were not to operate in a primarily profit-oriented manner. Rents were not to exceed 1/4 of a household's monthly income. Today, creating affordable living space is once again essential, if yet for different reasons. Frankfurt is suffering from an acute shortage of affordable housing and the massive displacement of lower income segments of the population from the metropolitan area. These circumstances led to a protest movement in Frankfurt called Right to the City, which has been operating for about 10 years now. We see similar structures in other cities. Too far. No. Today, 23 Ernst May housing estates still exist in Frankfurt. 10 of these as protected settlements, partly protected as a whole or single houses or structures. 3 of these protected settlements are currently subject of a program called National Project of Urban Development. Furthermore, there have been ambitions to have the New Frankfurt acknowledged as a World Heritage Site. Since the last 100 years, life has changed in these settlements. The number of people per household has decreased. Living space increased. 3-room apartments became 2-room apartments. The functionality of certain rooms changed. House facades were decorated or painted by the residents. And also a change from rent apartments to privately owned apartment can be observed. The relation between the settlements planned as serial housing and the wishes of the residents to conduct change to the houses was one main focus of the City Lab exhibition. It was discovered that in the settlements not protected, especially the ones with privately owned houses, change in structures or facade is common practice. For example, roof terrace or basement rooms were reconstructed as living rooms. Winter gardens were built or solar panels were installed on the roofs, as you can see here on the yellow house. So the following questions arose. What can these structural changes on apartments or single houses offer to urban planning of the future? How can specific needs be met under the circumstances of protection laws? Although the architecture of the Neues Bauen, the period of German architecture in the 20s, the New Frankfurt can be associated with was very strict regarding functionality. At the same time, it allowed a certain flexibility. Many of the residents of protected settlements told stories about certain rooms which have been used as living rooms, but today only function as storage rooms. This is because the structures of these rooms do not meet the requirements of certain laws. This might be, for example, 2 small windows and no escape routes, meaning that these rooms are not allowed as living rooms by law anymore. Here's a quote by a resident's daughter. When my mother was a child, she lived in Zickzackhausen with my grandmother and her sister. When she turned 16, she moved to a small room in the attic. I thought this to be great, as she had her own room and her own little world. Following today's laws, it is not allowed to live in these rooms anymore, as it opposed to the fire protection regulation. Nevertheless, we observe that these rooms in some of the houses are still being used as living quarters. For example, one resident told us that she moved there temporarily to be able to sublet her apartment during a time in which she could not pay the rent herself. These attic rooms are a great example for adapting your living space to your current economic situation. This led to the question, how can these personal needs be implemented in urban development, especially in protected houses? These needs can also be triggered through economic reasons. The personal drive to create variations to avoid a uniform look is clearly observable when walking through the settlements. Alterations have been made to smaller parts of the houses, like doors, windows, gardens, and entrance, as you can see here on the picture, which can be understood as resistance against the idea of uniform urban development and an expression of personal taste and creativity. The design of open and green spaces is also an important issue, and it is regulated differently in the settlements. There are many regulations. For example, planting your own plants in the green areas of the apartment buildings and playing football is not allowed. Drying laundry is allowed. Despite all that, residents tend to find some room for creating and shaping the individual and common space. This is more or less tolerated by owners and the Office for Preservation. On the other hand, we observed circumstances where the residents themselves tried to get certain parts of their houses safeguarded. One resident and participant of our workshop successfully registered her Frankfurt kitchen under protection law. This kitchen is safe now from being removed, and the cultural heritage of Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky, the architect of the kitchen, is saved. The topic of affordable housing is, as everywhere in Frankfurt, one of the dominating discussions in the settlements. In the 90s, the Live-in Charitable Act, under which most of the settlements had been protected, was abandoned in Germany, and many of the houses have been sold. The majority of the residents were forced to buy, though some of them wanted to maintain their tenancy. In 3 settlements, blocks, also now belong to profit-oriented actors, rental increases are part of everyday life there. In some settlements, residents fear their neighborhoods to be gentrified. Lower income residents are already pushed to peripheral regions of the city as they cannot afford increasing rents. So the general pressure on the Frankfurt housing market and the lack of political instruments are also affecting the new Frankfurt settlements. All these aspects regarding to the research about living in the new Frankfurt housing estates and current urban development discourses led me to the following questions. Where does participatory urban planning stand in the curse of monument protection? How can the right for affordable living and specific needs be included in monument protection? One of the central elements of New Frankfurt was that housing policies were based on the principle of the common public interest and non-profit, leading to other questions, especially relevant after 100 years of Bauhaus. What do we, as citizens, as individuals, as community, as residents, want to be protected today? The architecture or social utopia, the building or sense of community. The architecture of the new Frankfurt should serve the people. That was the core idea then and is a task for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katharina. I think excellent questions in these times, where again Frankfurt is feeling the pressure of a need of housing, a need of more buildings. In Tel Aviv, as I've seen on the picture as well, on the pictures, I haven't been there unfortunately yet. Thank you. So we close our little round of presentations, of pieces, of ideas, of things to be discussed today. And the discussion is open to everybody via chat functions in Zoom, YouTube, or Facebook. I will get the questions or statements then by hand written sheets of paper, and I hope that works. So that's the first in the series. If something screws up, we try to be better next time. To start the entire round off, I'm very happy to invite Jörg Haspel as our first critique or our first input, who should be on Zoom if things work out. And I would be very interested. He was also part in creating this entire discussion series, also with Philipp Sturm. He's here with me in the Dam. Philipp Sturm is the managing director of the Ernst May Gesellschaft. Yeah, excellent translation. And I hope I will see Jörg very soon on the screen here in front of me, because it's very difficult. Ah, Jeremy. Hey, Jeremy. But
Hi.
I was thinking of Jörg, but we can start the discussion with you as well. What did you think of all the questions Katharina raised on the participatory urban planning stand in the course of monument protection, or what do we want to be protected? What did you want to have the 5 houses protected in the last pictures you showed?
I think we can't avoid the process of protection. I mean, we have responsibility for our next generation. This is the first thing. And when my daughter is pointing new houses in Tel Aviv and she's asking me, is it for conservation? It always raises the question, and I ask her why, and she says, I don't know, the windows are really nice. So it's like everything has some value. So our main question is not what to protect, is what, you know, what is not important in a society, which is the toughest question, because everything has value. And who are we to decide for the next generation? So I think this is the idea of having different layers in the city and trying to see through everything and not being stuck about one concept or one layer of the city. For me, is the most difficult challenge in management of a city.
When you saw one more question, when you saw the images Heinz Vyansky showed of the two images at the very beginning of his presentation, the old 1950s Digusa chemical industry building, and on the right-hand side there was the new high-rise growing behind and town villas in front of it. Did you feel that this was appropriate? Would you do the same thing in Tel Aviv?
Unfortunately, we for us is a must. You know, it's a very tiny country. We have little space, so this is the type of solutions we are doing. I'm not really proud of saying that. I'm just saying this is our day-to-day work and life. You consider White City. I'm not flying. It's just an image, but you always move, you know, uncomfortably when you see that, because you see this contradiction of generations. And should we keep in the city center tiny little houses? It's difficult, and the more the city grows, the more it becomes crowded, the more the question becomes relevant. What can you do with a little nice houses of 2 floors in the city, in the center of a megapolis? It's not a city anymore. Is a much larger concept. Yeah, so I don't have an answer. I don't know. I really don't know.
Mr. Vyansky, you just retired from having the difficult job on deciding in Frankfurt, or on looking at Frankfurt houses, on what should be protected and what not. And you showed quite a few different examples. Is there anything which you feel you missed out on and which should have been protected better? And what do you think about the questions Katharina raised?
First answer is, of course, sometimes there are lacks, and some buildings could be a historical monument too, for different reasons, but that's not a problem. We have enough monuments, and we have to deal with them. First, going back to Jeremie in Tel Aviv, I think we can't avoid development, and we have to deal in conservation on one project maybe, and we have to deal with 2 branches. One is development and needs of our time, and the other one is to make it possible that the past its meanings and its forms and its materials can last. And it's always a new challenge with always new results. And that is what I wanted really to point out. The problem we have to accept, and we have to work with it. And that is, you said I had a difficult job. I liked my job. I was happy when there were good results. In my sense, it's like a sport. Yeah? Second, of course, there are people living in monuments. They use houses. It's absolutely not to criticize. Yeah? But I don't believe in participation. It's because my professional background was another. My partners are owners, local authorities, and we have to work together in a trustful way to solve certain problems. And participation, of course, an exchange with everybody and with inhabitants of monuments, of course, too. But I can't operate with this form in projects. Only when participation finds a way to be operable.
Jeremy, how is it on your side in Tel Aviv? Do you follow a participatory process when discussing how to alter buildings or how to preserve them? Your sound is not on.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the first thing I was thinking about is some figures. I think Mr. Haspel is having two telephones.
Right.
Yeah, we have you in two different angles. The amount of houses that are considered for conservation in Germany are 2% of the country. The amount of houses for conservation in Tel Aviv are at the moment 5.5%, which is considered quite a lot. Now, I believe in participation. I really believe in it. The more people are part of the process, the more we have chances for participating not only in decision making, but in the process of conservation. The more people will feel they like the houses, they know the history, the sense of pride, the easier it will be to make this change in meaning of conservation. In Israel, we are not really strong in processes of participation. We don't have this, let's say, the habit to do that. I think Tel Aviv is different in the sense that people are very involved in what's happening in the city. Like every project is presented in the national newspapers, and there's a lot of debates. Now, currently, there's a huge debate about what's happening in the Jaffa port, for example. Like every project we are presenting, it becomes a debate. So sometimes it's difficult for us, for managers, but it's very, very positive because people feel engaged. Now we're talking about brutalism is the new thing in Tel Aviv. So there is very difficulty of people to adopt this, new form of architecture, this reinforced concrete, etc. But the answer is yes. The more we get to communities, to different communities, different types of conservation, of ideas, of values, the more we have chances to have larger participation in these processes. Yeah.
Mr. Vyansky, would you have, having every project published in the national newspapers to be discussed on, let's say, a broader sense. Me as Deputy Director of the Architecture Museum, as an architect, I think, brilliant. Finally, people talk about architecture, discuss modern architecture. What a brilliant idea to get it more out there and to see more how important things are. Do you think that would change how a lot of people here see the value in these buildings which are currently being considered under monument protection?
What I miss is a kind of recension, right? Rezension?
Review.
Review of finished projects, or maybe some buildings committed to protection, and to criticize or to agree in a discussion or in a debate, of course. Mm-hmm. I miss it, and I miss arguments. Of course, it's easy to have a position without arguments. But to argue is the way you come nearer, and so I think that's the way, but it is not really elaborated. To mix the spheres of one side conservation, and on the other side promoting development. I don't fear it, because I'm educated architect, so I love it.
I think Jörg Haspe can now join our conservation. Jörg, I think your microphone is turned on, and maybe you would like to add from your point of view, or from Docomomo point of view, or ICOMOS point of view, also some aspects to our discussion.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and the host for having this kind of meeting here, and to organize a bi-national dialogue between different experts. And I'm also very glad to listen to the speakers and to see what are the problems and what is the attitude, how is the approach to conservation of modern heritage especially. And as I realized, there is maybe a very specific difference between the situation in Tel Aviv and Frankfurt. In Frankfurt, at least the housing estates are like a belt around the old city, and the city itself, the city center, has been redeveloped and remodernized and replaced sometimes during history, at least in the war and after the war. So maybe the housing estates are more like a relic of the 20s, of the interwar period, whereas the White City of Tel Aviv is an urban city center which is very vital, which is very dynamic, which is of a bigger and stronger dynamic as, for example, the housing estates in Frankfurt. And so the question is it really comparable, these two issues, or is the situation in Tel Aviv more a metropolis situation, whereas the housing estates in Frankfurt, they are looked upon as good models also to create affordable houses. There was one question I found interesting. it was asked or given to Jeremie, and he asked himself if this small housings in the center of 1909, which are only 2 stories, which will be left upon a new fundament, a new basement, if it is worth to keep them, because the situation is a little bit strange, and it will become more strange because of the other houses, of the confrontation of the scale and of the figures. And I think this is very important for heritage conservation, especially in metropolises. It's also a question to keep and to strengthen diversity. This small, even so small relics, and which are looked upon sometimes to be ridiculous in the result, it's very important to have different layers and to have a variety in the metropolis, and not to have only one level, only one time level, or one level of time and of style. And that is why I'm convinced that even in metropolises, it's very important also to look upon very small objects, as you did with the phone station, where you called your girlfriend and your parents when you were at the military. I think even these small pieces are very important to make cities different from each other, and not to have an international style of international cities which look all like the others.
I think you made a lot of different valid points here, and it's really interesting. I think the question of scale is, of course, a very interesting question, especially when I saw the project Jeremie showed, indeed, and of Tel Aviv. And I think we have 2 similarities. We have a similarity, Tel Aviv and Frankfurt. We have high rises. Tel Aviv has high rises, but you are right to say, yes, the Neues Frankfurt housing is mainly outside the city center, and which is on a different, let's say, vibrancy compared to the city center of Tel Aviv. I really look forward to traveling to Tel Aviv one day, I have to say. And yeah, I think it looks so interesting. It looks so interesting to discuss the question of how do we develop our city. We have the developers here in Frankfurt who, well, until recently at least, pressured, we need also more office space, we need more space for industrial buildings, we need more space for data center buildings, we need more space for housing, we need more space for public infrastructure. So this is a massive pressure on any city which is growing. And I think this discussion between Tel Aviv and Frankfurt is really valid and really interesting. How do we actually do this in our everyday life? And this is why I'm really glad that Jeremie and Vyansky are here to discuss all these parts. I have to read one question translated into English. The question is, how can we, I would say as architects and conservationists, convince the inhabitants that living or being in a monument, in a protected monument in a building, that this is an added value for them? Vyansky, Jörg, or Jeremie, anybody who can share light on this. How can we convince inhabitants that where they live and how that they preserve it is actually worth it for them as well? Hardest question, huh?
Yeah, I could start, if I may, just to propose an answer. I would say that people that live, let's say, for example, in Paris, they're very proud of their houses. They could show you the original window and floor, wooden floor, etc. This effect happened in Tel Aviv at the end of the 90s, when people gained back the pride of living in the center of Tel Aviv and having like original houses with high ceilings and original tiles on the floor, etc. So I would argue that as the more people understand a value of houses as representatives of larger social values, of history, they will gain pride of living in such buildings without knowing if they're for conservation or not. Just typical original houses become a part of pride in a community. I think it's more about community, about a larger scale of pride than only an individual. And this is the thing to promote, in my point of view.
It's a very good idea. You want to add something, Mr. Vyansky?
We very shortly, we try to convince, of course, with our works publications during the process of projects. But there's a border too. We spoke of inhabitants. This is a very personal relationship, and so one thing happened a few years ago. An owner of a protected monument, he wanted to sell his lot, and I asked why. We have to do some things, keep it, bring it in order and sell it later. Why do you want to sell it in this state? It's not very sensible, even in economic terms. And his simple answer was, and he nearly cried, I had in this house, it's my family house, such an unhappy childhood. I can't bear it anymore. So you have very, in our job, you have very close relationship to people, and there are some natural borders. This is one part, and the other one is cultural education, and we do it and we try. And you know, try it and fail, do it better.
Next time, exactly.
May I add one idea? I think there is no simple solution or a simple answer or even a recipe how to teach people to love their monuments or to love their heritage sites. But I think there is a development which you can see that there is an increasing understanding and estimation of historic places, and even of those historic places which were not acknowledged, let's say 10 or 20 years ago, for example, brutalist architecture, postmodern architecture. It's also a question of generation. So the younger generation finds it sometimes more attractive, more touching to live in a modern area with modern, for example, brutalist housing estates than it was for the older generation. So I'm very optimistic that the appreciation that it will increase. And maybe there is one question we could give to Ms. Böttger and ask her when we discussed the question of a nomination or of an application as World Heritage City of Frankfurt. How is the attitude of the residents, for example, in Neues Frankfurt? Are they convinced that this is a good idea, and are they supporting the idea to inscribe the Neues Frankfurt or the modern Frankfurt in a World Heritage List? Because that is very important for the success of a World Heritage nomination, not only of the nomination, but to keep it and to preserve it and to take care for it when it is already listed, and not to have World Heritage sites at risk or on the red list of endangered heritage sites. So maybe we can ask this also, where is the public support for this initiative, which will be taken by Hessen and by Frankfurt?
Okay, that's going to be interesting.
Well,
what is your experience? I mean, you can only talk about your experience.
It's different. I mean, there are people living, they just want to live in an affordable house, or just because he finds there a flat to live. So it's not the question if I live in a monument protected settlement or not. It's just I want to live in a flat in Frankfurt. And there are other people, they think when we told them that it's a long history this housing estates, that's an interesting history, and it's also a social utopia and interesting architecture. They find it, okay, they wanted to learn more about the history, and then they got really interested also in this form of living, on this form of heritage where they are living now. But there are also people, they're questioning themselves, why do we protect like the architecture, or why is it worse to protect the architecture and not like the idea of corporations or of affordable housing? Where are our political instruments? Why are so less affordable housing in Frankfurt now? And yeah, what should be protected? And what is important for us? So
I don't have the answer, but I would like to underline that housing estates of the 20, for example, in Berlin, and maybe sometimes also from Frankfurt, they are listed as World Heritage Site according to the World Heritage Convention of 1972. The idea of associations, of housing association, of building association is listed as intangible heritage by the UNESCO as well. So there is a very strong link between the architecture, between the tangible heritage and the intangible heritage of ideas of association and of cooperation. And I think we have to bring it together. When Jeremy asked the question, what does it mean, authenticity? I'm convinced that in the case of the social housing estates of the interwar period, that the question of affordable houses and of the social character of houses is part of the authenticity, of the historic authenticity of these houses. So it's not only it's not a site or an object of gentrification, but it should be kept also in this social sense. That is very important from a political point of view. And this will also help us to find a public support for the idea for World Heritage nominations, because as you see in Frankfurt, the houses are promoted by the Federal Republic of Germany because of their nationally outstanding universal value. And it is so much appreciated that federal money is also invested in keeping the houses, and not only to keep the architecture, but also to keep it affordable for people living there.
Yeah, I also think that's a question, can monument protection help to keep the houses affordable, or to, yeah.
That's right, because there was
utopia alive, or the sense of community to make it strong.
30 years ago, there was a slogan which said, Denkmalschutz ist Sozialschutz. Heritage protection means to protect people, residents living there. And I think there is a close link between heritage conservation and to keep the environment of people as it was or as it has survived, and not to alter it always and to replace it by other buildings, but to ensure continuity and the context of the surroundings. So I think it's also Denkmalschutz is also an aspect of Sozialschutz, but today it is also Umweltschutz. It means also it's a sustainable dealing with cultural and natural resources to keep not only the history because of historic arguments or historic reasons, but also to avoid material transport and the new architecture. So I think heritage protection is not only to keep heritage or tradition, but it is also linked to other social goals and goals of sustainable development.
So we don't have the answers yet, but we are exploring all the different avenues which we can do. I get one more question where I still have to have had a question back. So we can afterwards, I would say we close this session for today. And just to give you a bit of an outlook. We will repeat such a short, but I think very fruitful and very interesting discussion on the second Thursday in December, on the 10th of December, and we will discuss market halls and what to do with them as specific building types. And on the third one, which is also, I think, will kind of touch upon what we discussed today. We talk about the Liebling House and the Ernst May House. Maybe that helps that people appreciate the history and the fabric of the cities they live in. Maybe I can get I will ask this, and here, Sharon is asking, the profit-driven city development versus conservation, how to do these together without promoting the gentrification process? You mentioned the gentrification process in some of the housing estates, which are still rental buildings, but owned by different people. What is your stance, Jeremie, Jörg, and Mr. Vyansky, on this? How can we do this together without having the areas gentrified, people driven out, because everybody now loves the Ernst May House and they would love to get their hands on it, and without altering, of course, and preserving it, and paying a lot more than those people who are currently living there, for example?
I can start and tell a little bit about our local dilemmas for this conflict. We have two terms now we're using. Is micro housing, is trying to figure out whether it's really possible for new generations to live in a much smaller spaces that we're used to. It's kind of revolution concept. The idea is that they need less space, and the technology today, you know, like your house is where your laptop is. Trying to find some new solutions for micro housing. We're not sure how it will work out. There's a huge demand for that, and promoters are really pushing forward to use this concept. The second would be trying to find solutions for we live, like the concept of we work, like communal areas for people to live together, to share their expenses. And what you know from, I know from Paris, like Chambre de Bonne is like, you know, all these La Bohème stories about young students that come to a city center, they live in a city center, and you know, these little tiny rooms up in the upper floor of classical Paris houses. We don't have it in Tel Aviv. It's kind of affordable housing. We're not sure yet that we'll have the ability for families to stay in the city center, because, you know, it's a free market, and the more the city expands, the more it's expensive to live in the center. There's a high demand, but we're trying to be very innovative with solutions. But I can't say where we'll be in 10 years from now. We're really worried about it.
May I give two aspects would I like to emphasize? One of them is that one of the differences between Tel Aviv and Frankfurt, as far as I learned and as I understand, is that in Frankfurt, the Neues Frankfurt, the housing estates were social housing. It was not a mass housing, but it was social housing, and it was also linked to social aims of the politicians. And it is communal, or it is gemeinnützig. So there is a chance to keep it, and not only to keep the architecture, but also the social intention. I think Tel Aviv, the White City, is where most of them were private investment. And these is private, they are privately owned. and they have their own rights to do what they want within the regulation of building regulation, heritage regulation, and so on. And that is why there is a stronger tendency of gentrification, maybe compared to the Frankfurt housing estates. And the question which was sent us by Lieblinghaus, I would like to reverse it. If these houses are not protected, if they are not registered and not listed, will this create a barrier, an obstacle against gentrification? I don't think so. I think that the protection is one medium or one aspect to avoid gentrification, and it's not better if you do not have protected monuments or protected housing estates and quarters.
Vyansky, you want to add something?
Not so optimistic. Haspel mentioned the housing estates in Frankfurt were built outside. After the population growth in Frankfurt, all the parts of the city come closer. And meantime, the spaces in housing estates of Ernst May, they are more worth to be in these spaces, and it turns out to be a privilege, and we have to deal with it, but it's not easy.
So I say it's a work in progress. Jörg, you want to add something?
No, I only wanted to ask, if it is not listed and if it is not protected, would it be less complicated? Would it be easier then to keep people and to make sure that there is affordable houses? The protection is not a driver of gentrification. That's my opinion. It's also not an obstacle against gentrification, but I think it cannot be made responsible for this. When we started, for example, the 6 housing estates which have become World Heritage Sites in Berlin, to nominate them, there were a lot of people, and especially among the residents, who were very critical and skeptical against it. And 10 or 15 years later, they see that they are not the victims of the gentrification. They are not the victims of being forced to move to other quarters, but they still live there. And that is an advantage also for the residents and not only for conservation or for art historians.
Thank you. That is a very interesting aspect from Berlin. So we now open up the triangle. Unfortunately, our time for tonight is over. But I invite you very much to join us again on the 10th of December with other people and another background here at the Dam. We are currently looking at the inside of the Church of Gottfried Böhm, and which was part of an exhibition which we are dismantling as we speak to make space for other exhibitions. That was very special background in the auditorium and will not be seen anytime soon again. But it was a pleasure. I really have to say, it was an excellent discussion. I really enjoyed it, even though we could not meet in person. And I like this format, and I hope you did too. We're happy to receive any suggestions to improve even further, and I hope you enjoyed it, and you will join us 10th of December here again on the screen, on YouTube, Zoom, Facebook, and here in the hall and in Tel Aviv. Thank you for all of us, for all of you joining us. It was an interesting evening. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.